Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Magnus.
Good morning. Welcome to In the Word, and I'm so glad to be back with you. And I have to say a word of appreciation to Dr. Roberts and to Lee Magnus, who isn't here today, but thank you, David, for filling in and for helping out in my absence.
It's good to be back with you.
Well, I was thinking of the fact that we have a team here now, a three-person team, to be able to do In the Word, and it reminds me of Dr. Webb. That makes a four-man team. Of course, Dr. Webb now is not able physically to be with us anymore on In the Word, but we have three of us who are semi-functional, and we were a team at Milligan, all four of us.
Yes.
Dr. Webb taught church history and history of doctrine. Dr. Magnus taught Greek and New Testament. You have taught, what was it you taught?
Yeah, ministry and Bible courses. But
well, you taught preaching too,
yes,
preaching and
right.
ministries. And I taught Hebrew and Old Testament, advanced Old Testament classes, and some background classes for New Testament, Jewish background. And we all taught, except Dr. Webb, the three of us taught freshman Bible.
Yes, Old Testament in the fall, New Testament in the spring every year.
For how many? Seemed like 1,000 years. So we're so glad that we could be with you this morning, Dr. Roberts and I, and we're going to pick up where he and Lee Magnus stopped. And you kept saying you wanted me to come back.
We definitely missed you. We're glad you're here now.
Okay, well, we're going to talk about the book of Daniel, and this is the second Sunday that we're talking about the book of Daniel. Right. Why don't we go back and summarize the contents of the entire book so that we have a perspective of the forest before us.
It's a different kind of book, and it's fascinating for that reason.
It's different.
It is.
From, in fact, one commentator made the remark, and I think this is correct. It is the first book that we have, our writing document, that we have employing apocalypticism. Mm-hmm. And what in the world is that?
Well,
is it a disease?
It's a form of prophecy, but it's different from prophecy.
It is a form of prophecy, you're right. And the word apocalypse and the adjective apocalyptic are now in the language of the man on the street because of movies and TV programs and what have you. And what does it mean in the popular? How would you define it?
Well, the popular is the extreme ultimate end or whatever, but it's really the revealing. It's the opening up.
Well, in the biblical way of looking at it, it means to reveal. Mm-hmm. Reveal what's being revealed in a biblical apocalypticism. It's God, right?
Right. It's the word of the Lord. Yes.
And it is the encouragement. We'll be talking about it when we do get further along. But let's summarize the content. The first part of the book is not so highly apocalyptic.
The first 6 chapters are narratives or stories.
Yes.
And then the latter 6 chapters are the apocalyptic part.
Yes. Well, we would say we have 6 stories here.
Right.
And then in the second part, the last 6 chapters of the Bible, of the book rather, that we have in our English Bibles and in the Hebrew Bible. Mm-hmm. There are 12 chapters. Mm-hmm. But not so in the Septuagint Greek Bible or the Latin Bible, where you have other stories that are included that we don't have in our Protestant Bible, and for the book of Daniel. So let's summarize what the stories are about and think about what they communicate, and then we'll talk about the 4 visions.
It's the setting of the exiles who've been carried off into Babylonian captivity.
Right.
Daniel and the 3 friends.
Yeah, the early 500s BC.
Right.
Okay.
And the context is such that here are 4 young men in a foreign environment, a hostile environment in some ways, who learn to live in that, but learn to live with their faith in that. And that's what's important.
How do you live in a pagan society and keep your faith? And that's what this is all about.
Exactly.
This study that we're doing is on the subject of a living faith and how to maintain that. And so this whole quarter's been on that.
And that's where it's especially relevant today. The recognition that
yes,
we may not be in a friendly environment, but our faith is still significantly important.
faith is important. What do we have? Now you fellows, you and Lee taught the chapter 1. What was chapter 1 all about?
That was the setting of their adjustment to the Babylonian culture and the effort of the Babylonians to indoctrinate them with all of the background and the history of the Babylonians and the
language.
And the language.
They were being taught how to read and write.
Right, and their names were changed, although we've retained the Hebrew name for Daniel, but we've used the Babylonian names for the other 3.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, actually. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah.
Right, but in the midst of that, they rejected becoming so totally a part of the culture that they lost their Hebrew background. And so they resisted at the point of diet, specifically, whether it was an issue of kosher or excesses, but they maintained their diet, and in the process, they maintained their integrity as Hebrews, as believers in God.
I think it would be more appropriate to call them Jews at this time.
Right.
Beginning with the exile, that's what they actually referred to themselves as. Sometimes we call them Hebrew children.
Right.
And the old song does as well.
But that dominant tribe of Judah is what survived to the point of the captivity, and then in captivity they used the name Jew because of Judah.
Yeah, and that was the name they were known by.
Right.
By the way, I just want to mention one fact here. We have discovered a cuneiform archive in archaeology in southern Iraq of a Jewish family. It's the family of a man named Murashu, and already he has a Babylonian name, not a Hebraic name, and he was the father of several generations that followed him, the patriarch, of a business that this family had, and this family was incredibly rich. They had settled down in the exile, taken the advice seriously, and became integrated into that and became very successful and very rich. And I suspect when some of the Jews went back to rebuild Jerusalem, they didn't go.
Right.
They stayed.
It was a remnant that returned.
That was a remnant, right. Okay, what's chapter 2? We have there the story of the great image representing 4 kingdoms. Speaking
of the unfolding of history, but in the process, it's the issue of who is really in charge.
Yeah, what's the real source of eternal power? Is it the kingdoms symbolized by this beast, or is it the stone that rolls down the mountain and crushes it, which is called the kingdom of God? Now, what about 3? We're going to talk about it more, but what's the issue here?
Well, it's interesting that from chapter 1, at the end of the chapter, after they had tried their test time of a different diet, they find favor and do well and are
elevated.
Commended, they're elevated.
Yeah.
Chapter 2, because Daniel is able to interpret what things mean, again, they're promoted and they're commended.
Yes.
But in chapter 3, they're ready to be killed.
Well, that says something about the rule that they're living under.
Exactly.
They have here a megalomaniac as king who thinks that whatever he does or thinks of is going to be it.
Mm-hmm. A man his ego was out of control.
Right. So you don't bow down, you burn.
Right.
All right, what about 4? We're going to come back to that one. What about 4?
Well, in chapter 4, again, this egotistical ruler has his comeuppance.
Has his Waterloo, as
Right.
we like to say.
Yeah.
And he goes mad.
Yes.
And believe it or not, we actually have Babylonian documentation of the last king, Nabonidus, actually they put out propaganda against him that he was crazy. And he had left town and gone out into the desert to worship the moon god. And the Marduk priests apparently circulated these stories about him being out there because he's nuts. So there is actually in history a king who went crazy. Yeah. What about 5?
Well, 5, the absence of that king, there was a regent, and Belshazzar was the king, although technically not known as king, but
well, he's called king, but because he's functioning with the power of the king,
right.
But he wasn't really king.
Right.
He was King Nabonid's son, and we do have documentation outside of the Bible for him.
Yeah, but it was a time of opulence and conceit and arrogance again, and the hand on the wall.
We are the great ones, and the hand writes on the wall. Writes Mene, Mene, Tekel, Farsin,
right.
All of which means your weight in the balance is found wanting and you're going to be destroyed. And that night Belshazzar lost the kingdom.
Yeah.
What about chapter 6?
Chapter 6 is the famous lion's den, and that's Daniel again.
This is Daniel in the lion's den.
Right.
And he was told by the king, nobody prays. And this was an idea that some of Daniel's enemies put into the king's mind.
Right.
And he went ahead and prayed anyway. And the king said, oh, I'm so sorry, but I've got to burn you. No, put you in the
lion's den.
You'll get you eaten by lions.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
and of course, he survived the lions.
Right. And then the enemies are put in and they don't.
Right. Now, when you put all 6 of them together, what do you get?
Well, it's the recognition that even in a hostile environment, people of faith can maintain their faith, and sometimes
really are called upon to maintain
they
their
must
faith.
maintain their faith, and there are times when they may be commended for that, and there are times when they may be punished for that. But the reality is they've got to keep their faith in God anyway.
Well, and we're both very fond of what the response of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to the king's command was. We are not going to bow to your statue because we are not allowed to bow to anyone as a god except our God, Yahweh. And now if we won't do it.
Yeah.
And if it costs us our life, so be it. And if God wishes to save us, He will save us.
And that, when I taught Old Testament survey and we'd come to the book of Daniel, I'd point out that's one of the high points of the entire Bible. The recognition of these 3 young men that we believe in God and we are faithful to God, whether He rescues us or not. Even if it doesn't profit us, He is still God. We will still worship Him.
Exactly.
And that's important for us to remember today, too.
Now, a quick statement about the last 6 chapters.
Well, that's where
there
the
are 4
visions. That's where the visions come in.
And that's where the apocalyptic situation comes in. We're going to have to save that discussion, I think, for when we get to that chapters 9 and following, because that's what it's all about.
And you don't deal with apocalyptic the same way you deal with straight prophecy, because they're different genres of literature and different ways of talking.
Exactly. Even behind it, the two, there are different perceptions as to the nature of history and God's involvement in history. They're very different.
Yes.
And so we'll have to save that for a little bit later on. Let's go back now to chapter 3, where our lesson for today is. And it starts out, the printed text starts out in verse 19, but we both thought that we ought to begin with verse 16. And so since you're better at reading than I am at the present time with my eyes the way they are, why don't you do the reading for us?
Okay, the beginning of the chapter, of course, is where Nebuchadnezzar makes the image of gold and sets it up that when the music plays.
It's huge too, by the way.
Yeah, oh yes, it's huge, 90 feet tall. When the music plays, everybody must bow down.
Right.
And if you don't, you burn.
You burn.
So with that background, beginning at verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
That's where our printed text begins.
Yes, verse 19. He was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace.
Okay, let's stop there, because at this point there is an intrusion into the text that we don't have in our Protestant Bible. And it's in the Greek Bible, in the Latin Bible, sometimes in the Douay-Rheims Catholic Bible. And if for us Protestants, this insertion, which is a very long insertion, is in a collection of books that we call the Apocrypha.
Right.
Now, what's the Apocrypha?
Well, the books primarily of the literature between the Testaments, between Old and New Testament.
Yes.
But in this case, it would be an expansion on the story.
Yes.
And probably some of the legends, some of the verbal history that went on, and they included that in the writing then.
That's right. And what we have here is a document called the Prayer of Azariah and the Song of the three. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I read them this morning in preparation for coming, and the prayer is a confession of faith that actually, we what's happened to us, we deserve. God is just. But please, God, save us. Come back to us and save us, not because of us, but because of who you are, so that your name will be honored in the world. Okay, and then there are a grouping of blessings that follow that from the 3. So that's what's inserted here. So why don't you begin then with verse 24.
Reading on in the Hebrew then, the Hebrew Bible. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Wasn't it 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods."
Now look at that. Son of gods.
Yeah.
I don't know what he meant by that, but anyway.
It's somebody supernatural.
Yes.
But then the printed text goes on. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisers crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God."
Now, there are two more verses that we need to add
and read
on
that?
to finish
Okay.
the story.
"Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon.
I can't get over this. The king, even in granting mercy and blessings to the three, decide to cut into pieces and destroy their houses of those that would dare say a word against
Anybody who
this God.
disagrees.
Oh, one would have to say that the king still has a few rough edges still left. Yes, yes, yes. So, but the point of the story is clear. You do not bow the knee and attribute divinity to any human being, no matter how powerful that human being is.
Right.
And only Israel's God is to be worshipped, and that is the meaning of this statement. So, bold faith, yeah. Well, we have bold faith in all of these 6 stories. So, what makes this one bolder than the rest? I don't know.
It's an enduring faith, an unswerving faith. And in a context where virtually the entire world is saying one thing, you've got to have enough faith in God to be able to say he is still God and he alone is God. And we do not bow the knee to any idol, human or otherwise.
You know, what is faith anyway in the Bible? What is meant by the word? Is it just simply an idea that you have? Is that what it boils down to? A set of ideas, a philosophy?
It's a recognition of where the real power of the world rests, and a trust in God that he is in charge. No matter what the world may look like around us, it is still God who's in charge.
You know, a great theologian of a prior generation made this statement: who do you put your ultimate trust in? What and who or who? That's your God. By what if you put your trust in armies, ultimate trust, then that's your God. If you put it in the government, or if you put it in your bank account, or your position of authority, whatever you put your ultimate trust in, what is it that you spend the greatest amount of your effort and your possessions on? What is it?
And there are so many
That's your God.
temptations. We can trust in the power of our nation, or the powers of kingdoms, or we can trust in our own weapons. We're in a society that tends to think if we have more weapons than someone else, we're more powerful. And we've got to back off and recognize that God is still in charge of the world.
In the long run, in the big picture, ask yourself, where is the Third Reich? Where is the Soviet Union? Where is the British Empire? Where are they? Well, at one time, each one of those had excessive power. Now, some of them used it for evil purposes, And some of these powers used the power for good purposes.
And we have to be cautious. We love our country. We love our nation and our history. But our nation and our government is not the ultimate power of the world.
It is not the ultimate power. That's the key. That's the key. And so that's what this is about. I would like to put another title on it. Do not bow before false gods. That's what this is about, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Recognize what is ultimate in this world, and what is, let the force be with you.
Yeah, right.
I think it's a little bit stronger than that.
Right.
It is. We don't personify force and deify it. What we do is to say there is a God of love, of creativity, of forgiveness that we bow before and worship. And ultimately, in the long run, that is the God to be worshiped. Okay, so now thinking ahead, what is the context for this? Well, the context, according to these first 6 chapters, is a matter of Jews living in the 500s before Christ in a foreign land where they are a definite minority. And so they have been told by Jeremiah in a letter he addressed to them, it's in the book of Jeremiah, to take up residence there, pray for the land, do good for that land, because you're going to be there for quite a while.
Right.
Over a generation.
In chapter 29 of Jeremiah.
Yeah, right. And consequently, you've got to live there, and you want the best for that country, but there are still things more important, right? More significant.
It's interesting. We didn't mention, but in Isaiah, there's a passage that God is encouraging his people, and there's a promise that you'll be rescued even from fire. And in Psalm 66, there's that same kind of emphasis that
read the verse if you can.
In 66:12, you let men ride over our heads. We went through fire and water, but you brought us to a place of abundance. And in Isaiah 43, verse 2, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you.
Oh, yes.
When you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. But even with those promises, the 3 young men were saying, even if we do burn, God is still God.
And there are a lot of martyrs, even in our own time. Christians being killed, singled out to be killed in various places throughout the world. And so there's a reality. Well, we have learned then that for those who are living in a hostile environment, keep your faith and maintain it. And it involves not only knowledge, but also commitment.
Right.
And that's the commitment of faith.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, we're so glad that you could be with us today, and I'm glad to see you all here with us in the Word. Come back next week. We're going to continue with Daniel, and we're going to get into that apocalypticism. Come and join us. God's mercy and grace be with you today and this week.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.